just a quick point I do want to make is that sometimes it's important to report the results of things that don't have an impact. And I think that as policymakers might agree, you need to learn both from the good examples and the bad, and also think about unintended consequences of the interventions we make. I think that Ted and Rebecca Thornton are now going to talk about some of those unintended consequences of a study. You've already heard about Ted, but I want to tell you a bit about Rebecca. Rebecca is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan, and while she's not an affiliate of SIGA, she certainly has participated in SIGA workshops that we've done in South Africa on HIV prevention. She does a lot of work on HIV prevention and women's reproductive health, including menstruation, primary education, and health insurance for women. She did her PhD in political economy and government at Harvard University. She was then a postdoc at the University of Michigan Population Studies Center, and we're really pleased to have her here at UC Berkeley for the day. She and Ted are both going to present their story, and so I'll welcome Ted. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to present to this full auditorium and see all the interest in this work. I'll be presenting a paper called Education as Liberation, and as Tamina mentioned, it's jointly authored with Rebecca Thornton. It's also authored with Willa Friedman, who's a PhD student here at Berkeley, who's sitting in the auditorium, and Michael Creamer at Harvard. So we're interested in some different issues than the first two presentations, which focused more on HIV and sexual behavior. We're interested in how empowering women through education affects other social and political outcomes. And in particular, could education be used as a tool of social and political transformation? If we look around the world the last few months at the democratic revolutions in North Africa and in the Middle East, many people have noted that these revolutions were largely driven on the ground by increasingly educated youth populations, with women very actively involved in these democratic movements. So the possibility that educating women could lead to democratization and other forms of positive political change is certainly something that seems very relevant in the world today. It's not just in North Africa where these trends are apparent. In sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, over the past decades, there have been massive expansions in education, including in our study country of Kenya, where literacy has almost tripled over the last 40 years, from 30-something% to 87%. And where multi-party democracy, which was once unheard of 25, 30 years ago in Africa, is now much more common. So let me just show you a couple trends over time. This is a plot of education in Kenya. The light line are males, the dark line are females, and these are average primary school completion rates by birth cohort. So you see this amazing trend that as we move closer to the present, education levels rise dramatically. There's another very striking trend here, which is the education increases for men happened a couple decades before they did for women. So for the birth cohorts in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, very few women were completing primary school. But in the last couple decades, things have changed. So just for folks that would today be, say, 30 or younger, we have near parity. It's not quite there yet, but we're getting closer to parity in primary school completion for men and women, and pretty high levels. So there has been a big change in terms of education levels. There's also been a shift in democracy. So this is a different plot. The solid gray line is the average democracy score across all African countries, and the dark diamond plot is Kenya. And this is a scale on the vertical axis that takes on a value of 1 in very well-developed democracies like the United States, and 7 would be total dictatorship or autocracy. You can see most of sub-Saharan Africa in the 80s was at a 6. That's pretty bad. But a lot of countries are more like a 4 today, and Kenya has definitely shown improvement. So there's been a trend in education and democracy, and there's a lot of interest in understanding how these things may be related, and in particular how educating girls may be part of explaining them. So in stepping back for a minute, we may hypothesize in many different ways about how education could affect politics and affect society, and there's a very large literature in the social sciences on this. Let me just touch on a few of the leading themes. There's a sort of famous set of theories related to what's called modernization, which would argue that educating the population leads to progressive, modern changes that it'll lead to more pro-democratic attitudes, more secular identities, less ethnic attachment, and also a general spread of egalitarian values, including more respect for women's rights. A second approach, or a second set of questions, have to do with how education affects how people view authority. Does education reinforce authority? Is education used as an instrument of social control and indoctrination, teaching people basically to obey existing political authorities? Or does expanding education empower them to challenge authorities and bring about social change? The sort of North African example would feel more like the second one, the empowerment view. A third set of theories focus more on household outcomes, and in particular outcomes for girls and women, and include what role, or a question of what role education may play in granting women more autonomy, more freedom to operate, more choice in their personal lives. And one very important dimension of that choice in sub-Saharan African context is the choice, the ability to choose one's spouse. It seems like a very basic life choice to be able to choose one's life partner, but one that is denied to women in many parts of the world today. So let's focus on Kenya. I'm going to give you some background on Kenya and then some background on the study, and then Rebecca is going to describe our new results. So women in Kenya are disadvantaged in many ways. Domestic violence is extremely widespread. In surveys, recent surveys, 75% of Kenyan women report being subject to domestic violence, suffering from domestic violence. It's likely that those numbers are underestimates if there's some reluctance to admit domestic violence. Parents still often play a role in marriage patterns through bride price. Traditionally, bride price in cattle was paid in exchange for a wife. And there are few female lawmakers and politicians. That said, there have been a lot of changes. Kenya is a society that is changing. I showed you the education numbers. There's been a shift in women's autonomy in choosing their own spouse. So there's to some extent, women have more autonomy than before, but parents still have influence. It's a society where there's scope for improvement, but where change is certainly possible. What do we focus on in this study? We focus on the impact of a study that improved educational opportunities and educational outcomes for girls in rural Kenya, rural Western Kenya, and then resurvey these girls 4 to 5 years later to try to understand the medium-run impacts of those educational investments in girls on social and political outcomes. The program in particular that we studied was a merit scholarship program that I'll talk about more in a minute. Why is this approach useful? First, there aren't that many studies in African settings that track adolescence into adulthood, that even survey the same people in a longitudinal sense for 4 to 5 years. There's some, but they're limited, so that's one of the things that we do, which is useful. But more importantly, there are very few studies that have the research design that we have. There's a number of papers out there and research studies and folks who have documented the fact that more educated women in sub-Saharan Africa, more educated people in women in South Asia, etc., tend to have different social and political attitudes and outcomes than less educated women. There certainly is a difference, but we don't know where that difference comes from. In other words, we don't know whether it's the causal effect of education that's driving changes in political attitudes or something else. So there's a lot of obvious things that would differ between more and less educated people. Less educated people may come from poor households. Less educated people may have different intrinsic motivation or cognitive ability or geographic access to schools or a whole range of other things. And those confounders or omitted variables make it difficult to understand impacts. So what did we do? The Girls Scholarship Program in Kenya was carried out by NGO partners of ours in 2001 and 2002. There were 69 primary schools in the sample, about 3,000 girls, in grades 5 and 6. So this is towards the end of primary school, which has 8 grades in Kenya, but not quite there yet. And they competed for scholarship awards that were 2-year awards. Those were awards for grades 7 and 8. They paid for school fees for those 2 years and also gave the families of these girls cash grants. And the total amount of this award, the school fees and the cash grants, were large. They were an average of $38 over 2 years in a setting where per capita income was $400 a year. So this was real money people were competing for. The top 15% of performers on a standardized test won the award. And that was the top 15% across all the treatment schools in the sample. Now, what was the research design? We used, like the previous studies that were just discussed, we used a randomized evaluation or a prospective randomized experimental design where the 69 schools were randomly divided into a treatment group of 34 schools and a control group of 35 schools. In the treatment group, the merit scholarship incentive was offered. In the 35 control schools, there was data collection, but no merit scholarship. And randomizing who gets the award is really important because then we can say with much more confidence that the only thing differing between those that got the educational investment and those that didn't was the intervention, rather than all these confounders and omitted variables. Girls' scholarship programs are also of interest independently because there's so many large-scale public policy programs that look something like our intervention in Kenya, the NGO intervention that we study. There are large-scale girls' scholarship programs in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Egypt, Pakistan, and West Bengal and India. So understanding the impacts of girls' scholarship programs in general is of interest. This is a photo of a pretty typical-looking grade 6 or standard 6 classroom in Kenya. These are resource-poor environments. There may not be a ton of desks or textbooks. Obviously, people are sharing desks here. Another thing to note is when you get to the higher grades of primary school, there often are fewer girls than boys. And so this picture, in that sense, is kind of representative. But we're definitely working in a rural area, a resource-poor environment. So let me just summarize the results of the first paper that was published a couple years ago and turn it over to Rebecca for the recent findings. The finding of the original study was this incentive, this merit scholarship incentive, successfully raised test scores in the treatment schools and raised them by quite a bit. They raised them by an average of 0.3 of a standard deviation unit. So let me translate that into something more meaningful for those that don't work on education. This is roughly equivalent to the test score, 1/3 of the difference in test score between grades. So on average, it's kind of equivalent to 1/3 of a grade level in terms of test scores. That's a pretty meaningful increase in learning, and it's very highly statistically significant. You see that p-value there, p less than 0.01. That means we're finding this gain in test scores with over 99% confidence, statistical confidence. An important thing to mention is it wasn't just the winners or the girls at the very top that gained. We actually found gains in the test score distribution really throughout the distribution, even among girls who had very low baseline test scores, who had very little chance of winning the award. And the reason we think this happened was in the treatment schools, in the scholarship schools, the learning environment in the classroom was just much better. We have various measures of teacher effort and teacher attendance. Those went up in the treatment schools. Student attendance, student effort, those went up in the treatment schools. Having a subset of kids in the classroom working hard, striving for this award, seemed to have spillover benefits that benefited the whole class. This is actually the distribution of the test scores, if you can make it out. The blue plot is the distribution in the treatment group, and the red dashed plot in the control group, and you see they have this roughly bell-shaped type curve, but what's really notable here is the blue curve, the treatment group, is shifted to the right, towards higher scores. There's just a lot more kids who have higher test scores, and that difference is statistically significant. So this is what the raw data basically looks like. Okay, so let me describe the follow-up survey and turn it over to Rebecca. So what we did 4 to 5 years later is surveyed the treatment group and the control group. We surveyed about a bit over 1,300 of them in 2005 to 2007 when they were 17 to 21 years old. So they were young adults. We tracked them wherever they moved, whether they moved to Uganda or Nairobi, and we found over 80% of them, which is a good tracking rate in a very mobile youth population of this sort. And we benefited a lot from the fact that the cell phone network was expanding in Kenya. It made it easier to communicate with these folks. And we collected really detailed information on test scores as well as life outcomes, family outcomes, social attitudes, and political attitudes. So let me turn it over to Rebecca for the results.
So Ted spoke about the immediate run effects on schooling, which were after about 1 year, we saw these big increases in test scores. And what we found 5 years after this tracking survey among these girls is that we found still these large and persistent gains in schooling outcomes. So first we see that there were large gains in test scores, in which originally we saw about a 0.3 gain, but after 5 years we see a 0.2 gain in overall test scores. And that was across a variety of subjects that we tested these girls on. So first, test scores increased. And then second, what we found was that there was a significant increase in the likelihood of attending any secondary school. So there was almost a 30% increase in the likelihood of attending secondary school. And we know there's a lot of barriers to attending secondary school in developing countries, so this is quite a large gain. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, of course, this is a scholarship program. Maybe this is just mechanical. It's just the money that's getting these girls to have higher test scores and higher schooling outcomes. But actually, that's not the case. What we find is that it's across all of the distribution, even among the girls who were low-ability girls to begin with, who had no chance or very little chance in winning this award. So what we're finding is that there are actual education gains in this program. And so when I talk about the results on other factors, and I talk about the difference between the treatment and control, I'll be talking about actual education effects and educational effects of the treatment. So first, let's look at the impact on household and on female autonomy. So if we look overall in our data and the outcome in the tracking data, is that we find overall that there's a general high levels of support for gender equality. So, for example, when we ask the girls whether or not they agree with the statement, women should have equal rights and receive the same opportunities as men, what we find is overall high levels of agreement, but we find no differences between our treatment and control. So there seems to be no difference and no impact of education on general support. However, if we look more individually in terms of things that are affecting these girls, specifically, we find some big impacts. So first is in terms of spousal choice. So overall, there's no difference in terms of marriage rates between our treatment and control, so those who get more education and those who don't. But what we find is that girls in the treatment group are significantly more likely to be active in choosing their own spouse, and that parents are playing less of a role in those spousal choices. We also find that in terms of domestic violence, that there's a large, almost 30% reduction in the support for domestic violence. And in fact, the question on men can beat their wives and children if they misbehave, that significantly reduced support among the treatment girls. And so these two results on domestic choice spousal choice and domestic violence, this is some of the first causal estimates that we have of the impact of educating girls on these issues, and which is heartening for advocates who are promoting education in developing countries who truly believe that that gender empowerment is important for choices among girls. So then we next turn to impacts of this program on political attitudes and participation. And the first set of results that I show you, there are three sets of different types of results. And the results from these three items, that these show patterns that are inconsistent with the modernization view that Ted spoke about earlier. So first, we don't find although we don't find any impacts on increases of religious identity, what we do find is that girls in the treatment group are more likely to find support for ethnic attachment. And that's particularly true among the girls who were interviewed just before the 2007 Kenyan elections. So ethnic attachment and ethnic identity seems to increase in the treatment group. In terms of democracy and pro-democratic attitudes, we asked a number of questions, 7 different questions on whether or not the girls supported democratic institutions or if they agreed with statements like democracy is preferable. And what we find is that across all of those measures, there's no difference at all between the treatment and the control. So it doesn't appear that education is having a causal impact on supporting democratic institutions. We also look at political involvement across a number of different questions, and we also find no impact of education on these type of questions. So no change in reported political interest, on plans to vote in the next election, on involvement in local community groups, and importantly, on the perceived ability to be able to influence public policy. So where do we find impacts of education outside in terms of political views and involvement? So what we find first is that there's strong evidence that even though these girls are not having more pro-democratic opinions and they're not being more active in terms of their participation publicly, they're seeking information out. So what they report is that they report reading the newspaper more and switching from the media of radio. And in Kenya, radio is often more for music, for entertainment. They're switching away from that to newspapers. And newspapers is quite an important channel for learning about the politics. And in particular, they're 60% more likely to have a preference for the Daily Nation, and you can think about that in Nairobi and in Kenya as similar to our New York Times, where there are rigorous debates about politics involved. And they're more likely to seek out those channels of information. Now, coupled and consistent with that is an increased overall political knowledge. We asked them 5 different questions about whether or not they can name local and national leaders. And we asked them whether or not they know the name of the president of Kenya, the president of Uganda, the the Minister of Health in Kenya. And on these, there's an increased ability to actually know who their leaders are. Now, at the same time, while they're seeking out more information and more rigorous information, their respect and satisfaction for government are declining. So girls who are in the treatment group who receive more education, they have a fall in respect for authority, as a fall in terms of satisfaction with Kenya's government, in their leaders, and economy. And there's 5 different questions that we asked on that, and we find the same pattern of results. So these girls, they're becoming less satisfied with their government. They're seeking out more information. They've got more education, and yet they don't have channels. They don't report participating more, and they don't report that they can have an impact through public policy. So what we found then is that there seems to be a moderate increase among these girls for justification of political violence. So in a question that we asked about whether or not they support it is sometimes necessary to use violence in support of a just cause, we find a 3 percentage point increase of our treatment girls who say that they support this political violence. Now, why might this be? Again, it might be that they've got this heightened political awareness, this reduced satisfaction, and yet they're not able to express it. And is this that they're just being frustrated? Or it might be that they're actually more aware of realistic views of what it's like in Kenya and how do you express change in Kenyan politics. And there's quite a history in Kenya in terms of the democratic transitions of having seen violence to come and bring about these democratic changes. So for example, in the 1950s, there was an uprising against the British. This was a violent uprising. And more recently, in 2007, it wasn't until there was violent ethnic clashes where the opposition party regained some portion of power after a rigged election. And so it might be that these girls are getting more of a realistic sense of maybe we need violence in order to carry this out. Now, it's important to note that in this case, the democratic change was not necessarily driven by more pro-democracy attitudes. So we don't find that in the data. The girls in our data who are getting more education, it's not that they are supporting democracy per se. It's more that they're becoming more educated, getting more informed, and less satisfied with what they see around them. So in all, what do we find? We find that educating girls can transform a variety of important social and political attitudes. We find reduced satisfaction with authorities, both outside with political leaders as well as in the home. So when they challenge their parents, they are less likely to take their parents' choice for their spouse and less likely to support domestic violence. And one interpretation of this is that girls with more schooling are becoming more empowered and they're less likely to view themselves as powerless and that they are just taking their situation as given. Now, we also think that there are some important global policy implications with our results, that education programs in poor countries actually can have a causal effect in empowerment for women and social change for women. And we think that this is quite important because most of the evidence that we have linking education to empowerment seems to be more of a correlation story, and here we're looking at some of the first causal pieces of evidence. And secondly, we also think that it's important about looking at the distinction of when does violence come into play. So we see overall that, for example, in North Africa, with lots of these democratic transitions, or at least the attempts at democratic transitions, that in some cases it can turn violent, in other cases it's not. And it might be that in the context in which there are avenues to express dissatisfaction through different means, that as people become, and especially girls, become more educated, that if they have those channels, that it may or may not turn into a violent, into violence. And so we think that it's important that context matters, and especially in the case of our Kenyan girls, that they don't seem to have those type of channels to express themselves. And so we think that this is an important first step and first evidence for these linkages. Thank you.
You can raise them higher so I can see them too.
So, could you refresh my memory about how old the girls were when you came around the second time? Because I have a hypothesis.
17 to 22.
So don't you think that it's possible that they were too young to really have this be manifest in political views and involvement and understanding what democracy is? I mean, so I think you should go back and get more money and then follow them 5 years from now.
We're starting next month. On the
Oh, great.
follow-up,
Okay.
so.
And then and also it seems ripe for an intervention, which I think is where you were going, Rebecca, which is that they need a channel, and that would be interesting to explore venues for them to become involved.
Or do you want me to go? Okay. First of all, I commend you for doing this. I am from Western Kenya. And I have a little bit of a problem about this, that education is really like what Africa needs to, because as you mentioned, 87% literacy rate. Anywhere you walk in Nairobi, anywhere in Kenya, there are highly educated people who don't have jobless. Don't you think, who don't have jobs? Don't you think it's, rather than education, that we should focus on the type of education that people are getting? Because if you when we come here from Africa, we are way more prepared than to go to colleges, yet we excel. So that is not really a problem. I think the problem, we should look at what kind of education that they're receiving and support them beyond the primary school and high school.
I personally, I agree with you and on what you say. I think that it's also important to not just focus on primary education itself, that while there needs to be also, there's a lack of secondary education. And I also think that it's important that we look across Africa overall, that when we say education in Africa, that there's a lot of heterogeneity across countries, across urban and rural, that I think that's important as well. Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've made the point, which is right, that education levels have increased a lot. And the joblessness point you made is right on, in the sense that here we're finding the more educated you get, you're becoming very dissatisfied with the economy and society. And part of that could be the point you're referring to, which is you get more educated, but it doesn't really pay off. And that leads to frustration and dissatisfaction. That could be a channel that could be channeled into political dissatisfaction. So I think you're totally right on with that point.
Hi, I'm also from Kenya. So I had two questions. One about domestic violence. So you find that the girls who got the scholarships are less accepting of domestic violence, but do they also experience less domestic violence in their relationships? And I'm also really curious to see if eventually they might have sort of like higher rates of divorce or separation, because I think a lot of domestic violence happens unfortunately, especially with poorer women, and most people don't leave. So I think it'll be really curious to see down the line if they feel like they have more options. And then just sort of going along with that, when you followed them sort of after as they're older, do they have more economic opportunities perhaps than the girls who didn't get the scholarships?
Yeah, so those are good questions. In terms of suffering from domestic violence or being a victim, in this survey we don't have that data. Plus, only a relatively small share of them had married by this point. In the follow-up survey, which we're starting next month, we do have questions on being a victim of domestic violence. So we will be able to answer that question. And we also have, as they get older, they will be entering the workforce and whatnot. So the survey that we're starting now will allow us to answer your questions in a lot more detail in terms of economic opportunity, earnings, migration, all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned for part 2 or part 3.
My question was a follow-up to the one earlier on the type of educational training they had. Did you do any significant testing on the differences in standard basic educational training and more technically based training? And was that a focus at all in any of the research that you did? Because that age range, 5th and 6th grade, is critical for girls, whether they are in the U.S. or Africa or other countries, especially when it comes to more STEM-related education. So did you see any of that in your studies, and is that a focus that you will start to shift in, similar to the question earlier?
The original program was a merit-based scholarship and was based off of a cumulative score of exams. They were standard exams that were being tested by the district and by the nation. And so there wasn't anything particular about targeting the type of education to these girls, more just promoting them to take these tests and to learn for those tests. When we went back to test, we gave them tests of different types, and we looked at the test scores across the different subjects. We didn't find significant differences across, for example, Swahili versus math. We found overall gains in all of those, but it wasn't targeted to the different type of education that you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks. Did you or do you plan to do any interviews with the spouses themselves to get a sense, as an indication of whether or not the choices of spouses was influenced by education, and or whether the spouses themselves have been influenced by having more educated spouses?
In the current follow-up survey, there's a lot of information on those spouses that's going to be collected from these girls on the occupational, educational, ethnic characteristics and age, a whole range of characteristics of the spouses. We're not currently planning to survey them, but in the future, if we get more research funding for surveys, we may. And I think it would be a really interesting study. Thanks for the idea.
Yeah, my question is not regarding what's been done to date, but what's planned in future. One thing that I'm particularly interested in is as you look at the impact on girls in secondary education, is the impact, provided, are they mixed schools? Is the impact on their male colleagues and their attitudes towards women as it relates to, I mean, domestic violence has many parts to it, but in other studies that I'm familiar with, particularly as it relates to sports and attitudes about girls playing sports, it's the impact of not only how girls feel about it, but also how boys' attitudes change about what girls can and can't do and what's acceptable. So I'm just wondering if you're going to look at any of that or have the opportunity to look at any of that in follow-up studies.
I think it's a great idea. We don't have current plans. I think there'd be at least two different populations we could look at. We could look at the boys that were in these schools initially with them during the scholarship program. We could also look at the young men who were in secondary school with them or college with them. We haven't planned for that, but I think it's a great idea because it would really help us capture how much empowering and educating these girls was changing social norms around gender, and that's what will lead to really permanent, sustainable changes. And so it's a great idea, and I think it would be a good direction forward.
One more.
Okay.
Sociological impact. Do these educational programs include education for pregnant minors? What is the rate of pregnancy, and is there family planning included in the education for these girls?
So it certainly wasn't a focus here. There are sex education programs, HIV prevention programs in these schools. In fact, one of the people who studied them the most is here. She's a SIG affiliate, Pascaline Dupas from UCLA, who'll be speaking later on today. It wasn't our focus, nor was there any kind of difference in the programming in the treatment or control schools along those dimensions. But there is a sort of upper grade primary school program. There's sort of a nationally recognized curriculum on these issues. So that I think it took a while for it to be incorporated into Kenyan primary schools, and there were calls much earlier, especially in the context of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but it eventually was incorporated into the schools.